Don't let him drink that." The words cut through the glittering room before the billionaire could raise the champagne glass to his lips. Every conversation stopped. A string quartet fell silent. Even the soft clink of silverware seemed to disappear beneath the enormous crystal chandelier hanging over the Whitmore Mansion's dining hall. Aaliyah Carter stood near the service entrance, still wearing her black and white maid's uniform, one hand gripping a silver tray, the other trembling at her side. 30 feet away, Ethan Whitmore stared at her as if she had just committed the most unforgivable offense of the evening. At 48, Ethan had built a fortune worth more than most people could imagine. His name was printed on skyscrapers, hospitals, and financial magazines. Tonight, 300 guests had gathered to celebrate his $60 million acquisition of a technology company. And now a maid had interrupted the toast. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice cold enough to quiet the room all over again. Aaliyah swallowed. She could feel every eye turning toward her, wealthy eyes, judgmental eyes, eyes that had already decided she had crossed a line. She knew what they were thinking. She was just the maid, someone who carried plates, polished silver, and disappeared before the important people began talking. But Aaliyah had noticed something nobody else had. The champagne glass in Ethan's hand had not come from the same tray as the others. She had seen it placed there moments earlier by someone who was not supposed to be serving drinks. Then Ethan had lifted it, and the moment the scent reached her, something inside her went still. It was faint, almost impossible to notice beneath the citrus, the oak, and the perfume filling the room. But Aaliyah had spent years learning to notice small things. The sound of a mother struggling to breathe in a hospital hallway. The change in her father's voice when he was trying to hide pain. The tiny details other people ignored because they believed someone else would take care of them. "Please put the glass down," she said. Ethan's jaw tightened. A few guests exchanged amused glances. Somewhere behind her, a man whispered, "She's just the maid." Aaliyah heard it. She heard every word. But she kept her eyes on Ethan. "You have 5 seconds," she said quietly. The room seemed to shrink around them. Ethan looked down at the champagne, then back at her. "And what happens after 5 seconds?" Aaliyah opened her mouth, but before she could answer, his fingers loosened around the glass. The champagne trembled. A strange silence passed through the room. Then Ethan's face changed. The color drained from it. His breathing became shallow, and one hand reached for the edge of the table. Aaliyah dropped the tray. Crystal shattered across the marble floor. She ran toward him as the guests finally understood that this was not a scene, not a joke, and not an interruption. The most powerful man in the room was suddenly in danger. And the only person who had seen it coming was the woman nobody had bothered to see at all. The room erupted into motion, but Aaliyah heard almost none of it. She heard only Ethan Whitmore struggling to breathe, the hurried scrape of chairs against the marble floor, and the sharp, frightened voices of people who had spent their entire lives believing that someone else would always know what to do. Aaliyah dropped to one knee beside him, keeping her voice steady even as her heart raced. "Mr. Whitmore, stay with me. Look at me." Ethan's eyes found hers. For the first time that evening, there was no impatience in them, no cold judgment, no reminder that she belonged near the service entrance and not beside the head of the table. There was only confusion and fear. Aaliyah had seen that look before. Years ago, she had stood in a hospital hallway in Baltimore, watching her father wait for help that came too late. She had been 17 then, still wearing a school uniform, still believing that adults always knew what to do. But she had noticed the small things. The change in his breathing, the way his hand had pressed against his chest, the faint grayness around his lips. She had called for help before anyone else understood how serious the situation was. That night had changed her forever. It had taught her that danger did not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrived quietly, hidden inside an ordinary moment, waiting for someone to pay attention. Now, in Ethan Whitmore's mansion, the same instinct had pulled her across the room before anyone else had even realized there was a problem. "What is happening?" someone demanded. "Call emergency services," another voice shouted. Aaliyah kept her focus on Ethan. She told him to remain still and breathe slowly. She did not use complicated words. She did not panic. She simply stayed beside him, the way she had once wished someone had stayed beside her father. Around them, the guests began to whisper. Some looked at Aaliyah with concern. Others looked at her with suspicion. The difference was not difficult to understand. Aaliyah had spent most of her life being underestimated. She had learned how to move quietly through rooms where people noticed her uniform before they noticed her face. She had learned how to carry heavy trays without making a sound, how to remember every guest's preferences, and how to recognize when someone needed help before they asked for it. She had also learned that people often trusted a title more than a truth. Ethan Whitmore was a billionaire. Aaliyah Carter was a maid. In that room, those two facts seemed to matter more than what had just happened. But Aaliyah had not stepped forward because she wanted attention. She had not expected gratitude. She had not even expected Ethan to remember her name. She had acted because, for one brief moment, she had seen a human being in danger. And no amount of money, power, or social status could make her turn away. As the sound of emergency vehicles grew louder outside, Ethan's breathing began to steady. Aaliyah slowly rose to her feet. Her hands were still shaking. A thin trail of champagne ran across the marble floor, catching the golden light from the chandelier. Ethan looked at her for several seconds. "What is your name?" he asked. Aaliyah hesitated. "Aaliyah Carter." He repeated it quietly, as if trying to remember something important. Then the doors opened, and the room filled with emergency responders. Aaliyah stepped back toward the service entrance, ready to disappear into the background again. But this time, Ethan Whitmore kept watching her. He did not yet know who she was. He did not know what she had survived, what she had sacrificed, or why she had noticed what everyone else missed. He only knew one thing. The woman everyone had dismissed as just the maid had been the first person in the room to see him as a human being. By the time the emergency responders had taken Ethan Whitmore to the hospital, the mansion had become strangely quiet. The guests who had arrived laughing beneath the crystal chandeliers now stood in small groups, speaking in low voices and checking their phones. Aaliyah Carter remained near the service hallway, still wearing the same uniform she had put on hours earlier. Her tray was gone. Her hands were clean, but the feeling of every eye in the room remained with her. She had seen it before, the way people looked at someone who did not belong in their world. Aaliyah had grown up in a small apartment in Baltimore, where the elevators sometimes stopped between floors and the winter wind slipped through the windows no matter how carefully they were sealed. Her mother worked long shifts at a neighborhood pharmacy. Her father had repaired heating systems until his health began to fail. Money had always been measured carefully in their home. Every grocery bill mattered. Every unexpected expense had to be considered twice. Aaliyah had learned early that dignity was not something a person received from a bank account. It was something a person carried, even when life gave them very little else. After her father passed away, she had put her own plans on hold. She had once dreamed of becoming a medical assistant. She liked the order of medical work, the quiet concentration, the way a small detail could change everything. But dreams became difficult when rent was due and her mother needed help with medication. So Aaliyah took the position at the Whitmore estate. The job paid more than anything she had found in months. It also came with rules. Do not enter the main dining room during private meetings. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not interrupt guests. Do not touch personal belongings. And above all, do not forget your place. Aaliyah had never argued with the rules. She had simply learned how to work around them. She noticed which guest needed coffee before asking. She remembered who preferred the room slightly warmer. She knew which floorboards creaked after midnight and which windows allowed the cold air to slip inside. The mansion was more than 28,000 square feet, with polished stone floors, 12 bedrooms, and enough empty rooms to make a person feel small. Ethan Whitmore owned all of it. He owned private companies, luxury hotels, and an investment firm that managed billions of dollars. His name could open doors in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. People waited hours to speak with him. Yet that night, he had been saved by the one person most guests had not even noticed. As Aaliyah prepared to leave, a member of Ethan's security team stopped her near the side entrance. "Mr. Whitmore wants your full name and contact information," he said. Aaliyah looked toward the dark driveway where the ambulance had disappeared. "Why? I do not know." She gave him the information. Then she walked to the bus stop 2 blocks away, her shoes clicking softly against the pavement. She did not expect a reward. She did not expect a phone call. And she certainly did not expect the billionaire to remember her. But inside the hospital, Ethan Whitmore was already asking questions. He wanted to know who Aaliyah Carter was, where she had learned to recognize the warning signs, and why she had been so certain that something was wrong. His advisors told him it was probably instinct. His doctor called it extraordinary awareness. Ethan said nothing. He kept thinking about the way she had looked at him across that crowded room. Not like a servant looking at an employer. Not like a stranger looking at a billionaire. She had looked at him as if his life mattered. And for a man who had spent decades surrounded by people who wanted something from him, that simple fact was more unsettling than he wanted to admit. By morning, Ethan Whitmore had become the center of a story he did not want anyone telling. His name appeared in private messages, financial alerts, and news updates about a sudden medical emergency at his birthday celebration. His advisors called it an unfortunate incident. His public relations team called it a misunderstanding. Ethan called it something else. He called it a question. From his hospital room, he kept replaying the moment Aaliyah Carter had stopped him from drinking the champagne. The way she had spoken, the certainty in her voice, the fact that she had acted before anyone else understood there was a reason to act. By 8 o'clock, his chief of staff, Marcus Reed, had already arrived with a tablet full of reports. "You should rest," Marcus said. Ethan looked toward the window. Find out where she learned to recognize that. Marcus paused. "The maid." Ethan turned his head. "Her name is Aaliyah Carter." It was a small correction, but Marcus noticed it. Ethan did not usually remember the names of temporary staff. He remembered executives, investors, politicians, and people who could influence his business. He did not remember the people who quietly moved through the background of his life. Yet Aaliyah's name had stayed with him. By noon, Ethan had a preliminary report. Aaliyah had worked at the Whitmore estate for 7 months. Before that, she had worked at a hospital cafeteria and completed several medical assistant courses at a community college in Maryland. She had never finished the program. The report listed the reason in one sentence. Family responsibilities. Ethan read it twice. "What family responsibilities?" he asked. Marcus glanced at the page. "Her mother has ongoing medical expenses." Ethan leaned back against the pillows. For a moment, the expensive hospital room felt strangely empty. He had spent millions of dollars protecting his own health. Yet the woman who had recognized danger before his private medical team had done so was worried about prescription costs. "Bring her here," Ethan said. Marcus looked uncertain. "To the hospital?" "Yes." "You want to thank her?" Ethan stared at the report. "I want to understand what she saw." Aaliyah arrived 2 hours later, still wearing a simple navy coat she had bought secondhand. She stood outside Ethan's room with both hands folded in front of her. She had expected a brief conversation, perhaps a formal thank you, and then a reminder that she had caused a disturbance at a private event. Instead, Ethan looked at her from the hospital bed and asked, "How did you know?" Aaliyah remained near the doorway. "Know what?" "That something was wrong with the drink." She thought about the question. "I did not know for certain." Ethan frowned. "You told me not to drink it." "Because I noticed something unusual." "What?" Aaliyah looked toward the window. The glass was different. Ethan said nothing. She continued. "The tray had 6 glasses. 5 had the same small gold mark near the base. Yours did not. The liquid also smelled slightly different. Not enough for most people to notice." Ethan stared at her. "And you noticed all of that while carrying a tray through a crowded room?" Aaliyah gave a small shrug. "I pay attention." That answer stayed with him. It was simple, almost too simple. But Ethan had built his entire fortune by understanding that the smallest details could change the outcome of everything. For the first time, he wondered whether the woman he had barely noticed for 7 months possessed something that money could not buy. And before Aaliyah left the room, Ethan asked her one more question. "Why did you help me?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Because you needed help." Then she walked away, leaving the billionaire alone with an answer he could not purchase, command, or dismiss. The next morning, Aaliyah returned to the Whitmore estate expecting the usual quiet routine. She had barely stepped through the service entrance when Marcus Reed was waiting for her. His expression was different from the night before. There was no curiosity in it now, only caution. "Mr. Whitmore wants to see you," he said. Aaliyah looked at the clock on the wall. "I thought he was still at the hospital." "He was discharged early this morning." Something about the way Marcus said it made her pause. The mansion felt different. The laughter was gone. The music was gone. Even the staff moved more quietly than usual. Aaliyah followed Marcus through the hallway toward Ethan's private office. The door was open. Ethan stood near the windows, dressed in a dark suit, his face pale but composed. Beside him stood his attorney, Daniel Price, and 2 members of his security team. Aaliyah stopped just inside the doorway. "You wanted to see me?" Ethan looked at her. Yes. Daniel placed a folder on the desk. We have reviewed the security footage from last night. Aaliyah waited. There is a problem, Daniel continued. The champagne glass you identified was not part of the original service. Aaliyah felt the room grow colder. I know. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. You know? I saw someone place it there. Ethan turned toward her. You never mentioned that. Aaliyah looked at him. You did not ask. The answer seemed to unsettle him. Daniel opened the folder. There is no clear view of the person's face. But you know who it was, Aaliyah said. The attorney did not answer. Ethan's expression hardened. We are still investigating. Aaliyah nodded slowly. Then why am I here? The room became silent. Daniel closed the folder. Because you were the only person who touched the glass before Mr. Whitmore. Aaliyah stared at him. For a moment, she did not understand. Then she did. You think I did it? Ethan said nothing. That silence hurt more than the accusation. Aaliyah looked at him, remembering the hospital room, the way he had asked why she helped him, the way he had seemed almost grateful. Now, standing in his office, he looked at her as if she were a problem that needed to be solved. I stopped you from drinking it, she said quietly. Daniel answered. And that makes you the person who knew exactly when to stop you. Aaliyah felt the words settle heavily in the room. She had spent years being underestimated. She knew that feeling. But this was different. This was not someone assuming she was uneducated or unimportant. This was someone deciding that because she was poor, she could be suspicious. Because she was a black woman in a mansion filled with wealthy white guests, she was easier to question than the people who belonged there. Aaliyah kept her voice calm. If I wanted to harm him, why would I stop him from drinking it? Daniel did not answer. Ethan finally spoke. That is what we are trying to understand. Aaliyah looked at him for several seconds. The man she had saved was standing behind the protection of his money, his attorney, and his assumptions. You do not have to understand me, she said. But you should understand what happened. She turned toward the door. Aaliyah. She stopped. Ethan's voice had changed. You were suspended until this is resolved. She looked back at him. Suspended. It is standard procedure. Aaliyah gave a small, tired smile. Of course it is. Then she walked out of the office. No one stopped her. No one apologized. By the time she reached the service entrance, the morning rain had begun to fall. She stood beneath the stone awning, holding the small paper envelope containing her final paycheck. Behind her, the mansion remained warm and bright. Ahead of her, the bus stop was nearly a quarter-mile away. Aaliyah stepped into the rain. She had saved Ethan Whitmore's life. And now, the man she had saved had decided she was the one he could not trust. The rain followed Aaliyah all the way to the bus stop. It soaked through the shoulders of her coat and darkened the edges of the paper envelope in her hand, but she barely noticed. The Whitmore estate disappeared behind a line of tall trees as she walked, its golden windows growing smaller with every step. She had spent 7 months learning every hallway in that mansion, every quiet hour before dawn, every sound that meant a guest needed something. Yet leaving took less than 5 minutes. One conversation, one accusation, one decision made by people who had already decided what kind of person she was before they knew her name. At the bus stop, Aaliyah sat beneath the narrow shelter and looked down at her hands. They were the same hands that had carried trays, folded linens, helped her mother organize medication, and held her father's hand during the last week of his life. They were also the hands that had reached for Ethan Whitmore before anyone else realized he needed help. Now those same hands had become part of a suspicion she did not understand. The bus arrived 12 minutes later. Aaliyah climbed aboard and took a seat near the window. Water moved down the glass in long, uneven lines, turning the city into a blur of gray buildings and passing headlights. She watched the world move without her. Somewhere behind her, Ethan Whitmore was probably sitting in a warm room surrounded by people who knew exactly what to say. Somewhere inside that mansion, the glass from the night before was probably being examined, labeled, and placed into evidence. And somewhere, the person who had changed it was still free. Aaliyah closed her eyes. She could have told Ethan everything she had noticed. She could have described the person near the drink table. She could have mentioned the small gold cuff link she had seen reflected in the glass cabinet. But she had already learned something important. People who wanted the truth usually listened when you spoke. People who wanted someone to blame only waited for their turn to accuse you. When Aaliyah reached home, her mother was sitting near the kitchen window with a cup of tea. You are home early, her mother said. Aaliyah placed the envelope on the table. I was suspended. Her mother looked at her carefully. Why? Aaliyah took off her wet coat. They think I might have done something wrong. Her mother did not ask what. She simply reached across the table and covered Aaliyah's hand with her own. The kitchen was small. The paint near the window had begun to fade. A refrigerator hummed softly in the corner. Nothing in the room was expensive, but everything was familiar. Aaliyah sat down. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Outside, rain tapped against the glass. Inside, the clock above the stove moved 1 second at a time. Aaliyah thought about Ethan's face when he had asked why she helped him. She had answered because he needed help. She still believed that. Even now, that was the part that made everything hurt. She did not regret saving him. She regretted that the world had made kindness feel like a mistake. Across town, Ethan Whitmore stood alone in his hospital room, staring at the same rain. He had told himself that suspending Aaliyah was simply a precaution, a standard procedure, a necessary decision. But the words sounded different each time he repeated them. He remembered her standing in his office, calm while everyone questioned her. He remembered the disappointment in her eyes. Not fear, not anger, disappointment. And for the first time in years, Ethan understood that a person could be hurt without raising their voice. If this moment touched your heart, remember this. Sometimes the greatest test of a person is not whether they can do the right thing, but whether they can continue believing in goodness after the world punishes them for it. Aaliyah went to bed that night believing she had lost a job. Ethan went to bed believing he had made a difficult decision. Neither of them knew that by morning, the truth would begin moving quietly through the walls of the Whitmore estate. By 6:30 the next morning, the rain had stopped, but the Whitmore estate still felt heavy with silence. Ethan stood in the private dining room with a cup of coffee untouched in his hand, while Marcus Reed reviewed the latest security report. "There is something you should see," Marcus said. Ethan looked up. On the tablet was a timeline from the night of the celebration. Every movement around the dining room had been recorded by the estate security system. Ethan watched the footage carefully. Guests moved between tables. Staff carried trays. Aaliyah entered the room from the service hallway. She stopped near the drink station. Then, several minutes later, a man in a dark suit stepped into the same area. His face was partially hidden by the angle of the camera, but Ethan recognized the posture immediately. "Pause it," he said. Marcus stopped the video. Ethan stared at the screen. The man was Daniel Price, his attorney. "That cannot be right," Ethan said. Marcus turned toward him. "We checked the timestamp 3 times. Ethan said nothing. He watched the footage again. Daniel had entered the drink area carrying a glass. He had left less than a minute later. After that, Ethan had picked up the champagne glass Aaliyah had warned him about. Marcus opened another file. There is more. The glass had been sent for testing. The results had arrived early that morning. The substance inside it was not part of the original champagne service. It had been introduced after the drinks were placed on the table. Ethan slowly set down his coffee. Who had access? Marcus handed him a second report. Several people. But only 3 people were close enough during that window. Ethan read the names. Daniel Price, a senior event manager, and Aaliyah Carter. His eyes stopped on the third name. "Aaliyah did not do this," he said. Marcus did not answer. Ethan looked at him. "You agree?" "I agree that the footage does not support the accusation against her." That sentence landed harder than Ethan expected. The footage did not support the accusation. The accusation had never been supported by anything except suspicion. Ethan remembered Aaliyah standing in his office. He remembered her asking why she was there. He remembered the way he had allowed Daniel to question her without asking himself the simplest question of all. Who had the most to gain from blaming her? Ethan immediately called Daniel. There was no answer. He called again. Still nothing. Then his phone displayed a message from the estate manager. Daniel had left the property before sunrise. Ethan felt a cold uneasiness settle over him. He walked to the window. The same room where Aaliyah had once stood, watching the rain, now looked different. Every detail seemed sharper. The polished floor, the empty chair, the untouched flowers from the previous night. He thought about the words she had spoken before leaving. "You do not have to understand me, but you should understand what happened." Ethan had failed to do both. Marcus stepped closer. "What do you want to do?" Ethan looked at the screen again. Aaliyah Carter. Suspended. Questioned. Sent home in the rain. The only person who had protected him when everyone else was celebrating. "Find her," Ethan said. Marcus nodded. Ethan stopped him before he reached the door. And Marcus? Yes. No lawyers. No security team. No one else. Marcus understood. Ethan was not going to send a representative. He was going himself. Because the truth had finally become impossible to ignore. The woman he had suspected had saved him. The man he had trusted had been standing much closer to the truth than anyone realized. And somewhere across the city, Aaliyah Carter still believed that. Ethan Whitmore had chosen suspicion over her simply because she was the easiest person in the room to doubt. By late afternoon, Ethan Whitmore was sitting in a car outside a modest brick apartment building in Baltimore. He had driven there himself. No driver. No assistant. No security team waiting nearby. For the first time in years, he had entered a neighborhood without anyone opening a door for him. The building was older than anything he owned. Its front steps showed years of rain and winter weather. A small flower pot sat beside the entrance, carefully watered despite the fading leaves. Ethan stood there for several seconds before pressing the buzzer. Aaliyah answered the door after the third ring. When she saw him, her expression changed. Not fear. Not surprise. Something quieter. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Ethan looked at her. He had prepared an explanation during the entire drive. None of it sounded right now. "I need to talk to you." Aaliyah kept one hand on the door. "About what?" Ethan took a breath. "The champagne." She studied his face. "Did you find something?" "Yes." He told her about the security footage. He told her about Daniel Price. He told her that the glass had been altered after the drinks were placed on the table. He told her that the accusation against her had been wrong. Aaliyah listened without interrupting. When he finished, the hallway became very quiet. "So you believe me now," she said. Ethan looked down for a moment. "I know you were telling the truth." "That is not what I asked." He looked back at her. "Yes, I believe you now." Aaliyah nodded slowly. She did not smile. She did not invite him inside. Ethan understood why. He had come to her home after sending her away from his. He had asked her questions as if she were the problem. He had allowed his attorney to suggest that the woman who saved his life might have been responsible for putting him in danger. And now he stood there expecting one apology to repair everything. "I was wrong," he said. The words felt unfamiliar. Ethan Whitmore had spent most of his adult life making decisions and defending them. He had built companies by refusing to retreat. He had learned to see doubt as weakness. But standing outside Aaliyah's apartment, he realized that admitting a mistake required more courage than pretending one had never been made. Aaliyah looked past him toward the street. "You were not just wrong," she said. "You were willing to believe the worst about me because I was the easiest person to suspect." Ethan did not argue. He could not. "You are right." Her eyes returned to his. "I did not need you to trust me because I was a maid. I needed you to listen because I was telling you the truth." The sentence stayed between them. Ethan felt the weight of it. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who listened because he had power. Aaliyah had been the only person who had spoken to him when she had nothing to gain. "What can I do?" he asked. Aaliyah gave a quiet breath. "You cannot undo what happened." Ethan nodded. "No, and you cannot buy your way out of it." "I know." For the first time, something softened in her expression. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But recognition. Ethan stepped back from the doorway. "Then I will start by telling the truth." Aaliyah looked at him. "To everyone?" "Everyone who heard the accusation." She studied him for another moment. Then she opened the door slightly wider. That would be a start. Ethan did not enter. He simply nodded. Aaliyah had saved his life without asking for anything. Now he understood that forgiveness was not something money could purchase. It was something trust had to earn, one honest choice at a time. 3 months later, the Whitmore estate no longer felt like the same place. The chandeliers still glowed above the marble floors. The long dining table still held more chairs than most families would ever need. The gardens still stretched across acres of carefully trimmed green. But something had changed. Aaliyah Carter no longer worked there as a maid. She had returned to school, enrolling in a medical assistant program with her tuition covered by a scholarship she had accepted only after reading every condition twice. Ethan Whitmore had offered to pay for her education. Aaliyah had refused the first offer. Then Ethan had changed the arrangement. He created a scholarship fund for employees and their families, with an independent board managing every dollar. No special treatment. No private favors. No obligation to him. That was the only way Aaliyah agreed. Daniel Price was no longer Ethan's attorney. The investigation had revealed that he had manipulated the champagne service and then encouraged suspicion toward Aaliyah to protect himself. Ethan had made sure every person who had heard the accusation also heard the truth. He had called the guests from the celebration personally. He had told them that Aaliyah Carter had saved his life, that she had been wrongly suspected, and that the failure had been his. Some people were uncomfortable hearing it. Some apologized. A few never responded. Ethan learned that making a public correction did not erase a private mistake, but it was still necessary. On a bright Saturday morning, Aaliyah returned to the Whitmore estate for the first time since her suspension. She was not wearing a uniform. She wore a simple blue blouse, dark trousers, and the small silver watch her father had once given her. Ethan was waiting near the entrance. He had not asked her to come for a ceremony. There were no cameras, no reporters, no guests. He simply wanted her to see the new scholarship office that had opened in the renovated East Wing. Aaliyah walked through the hallway slowly. On the wall were photographs of employees who had received assistance for school, training, and professional certifications. Her name was not there. Ethan had made sure of that. This was not supposed to be a monument to one person. It was supposed to become something larger than the mistake that had started it. Aaliyah stopped beside a window overlooking the garden. "You really changed this place," she said. Ethan stood a few feet away. "You did." She looked at him. "I only stopped you from drinking a glass of champagne." Ethan smiled faintly. "You did more than that." Aaliyah did not answer. She watched the sunlight move across the floor. Ethan had once believed that power meant making people wait for him. Now he understood that sometimes power meant being willing to wait for someone else. Aaliyah had not become wealthy overnight. She had not forgotten the accusation. She had not suddenly become part of Ethan's world. She had simply continued forward. And Ethan had finally learned to move differently. Before she left, he held the door open for her. Aaliyah paused. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she stepped outside. Ethan remained behind. The afternoon light touched the path, warm and quiet. Aaliyah walked toward the gate, her footsteps growing softer with distance. Behind her, the billionaire stood in the doorway, watching the woman he had once barely noticed disappear into the sunlight. He had saved her career. He had helped create opportunities for people who had been overlooked. But he knew the truth. The greatest change had begun much earlier, in a crowded dining room, when a black maid had looked at a powerful man and seen a human being before anyone else did. And sometimes, the quietest act of kindness does not end with a reward. Sometimes, it simply changes the direction of every life it touches.